The sun was barely cutting through the early morning haze when the streets of Riverton, a mid-sized American city known for its annual Independence Day parade, began to buzz with energy. Folding chairs lined the sidewalks, children waved tiny flags, and local marching bands tuned their instruments. It was the kind of small-town patriotism that seemed straight out of a Norman Rockwell painting, until one ugly moment shattered the illusion. Monique Harris, a poised black woman in her late 40s wearing a simple volunteer vest, was walking toward the check-in point for parade staff. She had been invited by organizers to lend a hand, greeting families, guiding participants, and ensuring everything ran smoothly. What no one on that street yet realized was that Monique wasn't just a helpful community volunteer. She was also a sitting United States Senator on the Armed Services Committee, a woman with national influence and decades of public service. But on this morning, to one police officer, none of that mattered. Officer Jason Whitaker, a tall white patrolman with mirrored sunglasses, eyed Monique with immediate suspicion as she approached the barricade. He stepped forward, his hand hovering near his belt, his tone clipped and dismissive. "You can't be here, step back," he ordered, his voice loud enough for people nearby to turn their heads. Monique calmly explained, "I'm with the volunteer team. I have my badge here. I'm supposed to be inside the checkpoint." Jason glanced at the badge briefly, then shook his head. "Doesn't matter. We don't need any unauthorized people wandering around. Move back across the street." Several onlookers exchanged puzzled looks. Others avoided eye contact, sensing tension. Monique tried again, her tone still measured. "Sir, I've been cleared by the parade committee. If you'd like, I can call the coordinator." But Jason's voice grew sharper. "I said step back. Don't make me repeat myself." He reached for her arm, his grip firm, as if to physically escort her away. The crowd gasped. What Jason didn't realize was that not 50 feet away, a local reporter, Danielle Coleman, had been live streaming the parade preparations for her outlet's social media feed. Her camera caught every word, every gesture, the dismissive tone, the unnecessary hostility, the aggressive hand on Monique's arm. Monique gently but firmly pulled her arm free. "You are making a mistake," she said, her voice low but steady. Jason sneered. "No, you're the one making a mistake thinking you can waltz in here without clearance. We don't need troublemakers at this parade." That word, troublemaker, hung in the air, sharp and cutting. A mother standing nearby whispered to her teenage son she wasn't doing anything wrong. The boy, eyes wide, whispered back, "Why's he talking to her like that?" Within minutes, whispers rippled through the crowd. Some people recognized Monique, though not all could place her exact role. Others simply sensed something wasn't right. A volunteer coordinator, Brett Morgan, hurried over, his face red with frustration. "Officer, she's with us," Brett said quickly, pulling out a roster. "Her name's right here. She's authorized to be inside." Jason barely looked at the paper. "I don't care what your list says, she's not coming through." The air grew heavier. What should have been a day of celebration now felt like a stage for conflict. People pulled out their phones, murmurs grew louder, and in the middle of it all stood Monique, respected, composed, but treated like she didn't belong. She took a step back, not out of submission, but out of calculation. She had spent her career learning when to push forward and when to let someone hang themselves with their own arrogance. Looking directly at Jason, she said with deliberate calm, "Officer, you may want to reconsider this course of action." Jason smirked. "Or what? You going to file a complaint? Good luck with that." Danielle Coleman's camera kept rolling, her audience count ticking upward by the second. People began commenting in real time. "That's Senator Harris. Is this for real? He doesn't know who she is? This is embarrassing for the city." Monique, without raising her voice, delivered the line that shifted the entire scene. "I am United States Senator Monique Harris, member of the Armed Services Committee, and right now, officer, you are obstructing a federal legislator from fulfilling her duties." The street fell silent. Even the kids waving flags seemed to freeze. Brett Morgan's jaw dropped. Danielle nearly fumbled her phone in shock. And Jason, still gripping her volunteer vest as if it proved something, looked suddenly pale beneath his sunglasses. But the damage was already done. The crowd had seen. The cameras had captured. The story was in motion. And it was only the beginning. The 4th of July parade in Riverton, a city that prided itself on its deep roots in American tradition, was supposed to be a joyous event. For decades, families had gathered along Main Street, waving flags and waiting for the floats, the marching bands, and the spectacle of patriotism. Children wore red, white, and blue face paint. Local veterans straightened their uniforms with pride. Vendors sold popcorn and snow cones. It was the kind of event where everyone seemed to know someone, where neighbors greeted neighbors, and where the illusion of unity was meant to be on full display. But under the morning sunshine, as the bands warmed up and the announcers tested their microphones, something else was brewing. At the corner of Maple Avenue and 3rd Street, Officer Jason Whitaker stood beside the barricades, scanning the crowd like a gatekeeper. He wasn't smiling like many of the officers assigned to the parade. He wasn't chatting with children or reassuring elderly attendees. His stance was rigid, his posture bristling with authority, and his eyes darted toward anyone who didn't look like they belonged. And then he saw her. Monique Harris, dressed in a volunteer vest with a laminated badge clipped neatly to her shirt, walked with quiet confidence toward the restricted area. She wasn't flashy, and she wasn't demanding attention, but there was something about her presence that naturally drew it. People made space for her without realizing it. Jason didn't like it. "Hold up," he barked, extending one hand as she neared the barricade. "This area's restricted." Monique smiled politely. "I'm with the volunteer team. Here's my badge. I'm supposed to check in with the parade coordinator." Jason took a quick glance, barely registering the details, then shook his head dismissively. "Doesn't matter. We're not letting just anyone waltz in." Step back across the street. Nearby, families quieted. A father holding his daughter's hand frowned. A grandmother clutching a flag muttered under her breath. People could sense when an encounter carried weight, when something wasn't just a routine check. Monique remained calm. "Sir, I've been cleared. If you'd like, I can call the coordinator right now." Jason's jaw tightened. He didn't want negotiation. He wanted control. "I said move. Don't argue with me." When Monique didn't immediately comply, he stepped closer, his hand gripping her arm firmly, almost possessively. "You're not coming through. End of discussion." The crowd gasped. Danielle Coleman, a local reporter covering the parade's preparations for her online channel, had been live streaming nearby. She quickly angled her phone, capturing the officer's aggressive posture, his hand on Monique's arm, and the tension rising with every word. The comments section exploded almost instantly. "Why's he grabbing her? She showed her badge. What's the problem? This looks bad." Monique gently freed her arm. Her voice was steady, deliberate. "Officer, you're making a mistake," Jason smirked. "No, you're the one making a mistake thinking you can sneak in with that vest. You're not supposed to be here. Move it." The dismissive tone, the unwillingness to even check her credentials thoroughly, rang loud and clear. For many in the crowd, it was obvious what this was about. Brett Morgan, the parade coordinator, rushed over, flustered. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he waved a clipboard. "She's with us. Her name's on the roster. Senator—" He caught himself before saying too much. "Monique Harris is a registered volunteer today. She's supposed to be inside." Jason didn't even look at the clipboard. "I don't care what your paperwork says. She's not coming in." By now, whispers spread through the growing crowd. Some recognized her. A teacher whispered to her colleague, "That's Senator Harris, isn't it?" A teenage boy pulled up her picture on his phone, showing it to his mother. "Look, it's her. She's on the Armed Services Committee." Danielle Coleman's live stream began to surge with viewers. The chat lit up with disbelief. "That cop has no clue. This is humiliating. How's he going to explain this?" Monique took a slow breath. She had learned long ago not to meet anger with anger. Her power was in her composure, in forcing others to reveal themselves. Looking directly at Jason, she said quietly but firmly, "You are obstructing a United States senator." For a moment, Jason's smirk faltered, but arrogance quickly reasserted itself. "Lady, don't play games with me. If you were really who you claim, you wouldn't be out here in a vest like this," Brett gasped. "She is who she says she is. This is absurd." The crowd edged closer, the murmurs rising like a wave. Phones were out everywhere. Parents whispered to their children. Veterans in uniform exchanged uneasy glances. What was supposed to be a celebration of unity was unraveling into a spectacle of division. Monique stood her ground, eyes unwavering. "You're going to regret these words, officer. Because every second you continue this, you're not just disrespecting me, you're disrespecting the office I hold and the people I represent." Jason laughed, a brittle sound. "Yeah? And what office is that?" The silence that followed was heavy. Monique straightened her shoulders. "I am Senator Monique Harris, member of the United States Senate Armed Services Committee, and you, officer, are detaining me without cause." The crowd erupted. Gasps, whispers, shouts. Danielle's live stream viewer count soared into the thousands. Comments flooded in. "She just said it, Senator Harris. Oh my God, he's done for." This is history unfolding right here. Jason's grip on authority slipped visibly. He stammered, That's not possible." But the conviction in his voice was gone. His arrogance had collided with reality, and reality was winning. Monique didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her presence alone commanded attention. She simply added, "Now, officer, are you going to let me through, or are you going to escalate this mistake even further?" The choice hung in the air, undeniable. But the damage was already done. The cameras had caught it all. The city of Riverton had a front row seat to an officer humiliating a sitting senator. And soon the entire country would see. The 4th of July parade in Riverton had always been a source of pride. Families camped out on sidewalks with coolers and lawn chairs, children clutched sparklers, and marching bands rehearsed their patriotic tunes. City officials liked to boast that the Riverton Parade was one of the largest in the state, a symbol of small-town unity and American tradition. Yet on this particular morning, unity cracked under the weight of one officer's arrogance. Officer Jason Whitaker had been posted at the Maple Avenue checkpoint, one of several barricades restricting access to the inner parade route. Unlike other officers who exchanged light-hearted banter with families, Jason stood stiff, arms crossed, radiating an air of suspicion. He had built a reputation around town for being by the book in a way that too often crossed into hostility. And when he spotted a black woman in a volunteer vest approaching his barricade, his eyes narrowed. That woman was Monique Harris. To the public, she appeared to be just another community helper. She wore the bright yellow vest issued by the committee, and in her hand was a badge clipped neatly with her name. What no one knew, at least not at first glance, was that Monique was a U.S. Senator, one of the most influential figures on the Armed Services Committee. She wasn't there for recognition or applause. She was there because she loved her community. Every year she volunteered at the parade, a tradition that reminded her of her roots in Riverton. Jason, however, wasn't interested in tradition. He lifted a hand abruptly. "Stop right there," he barked. "This area's restricted." Monique stopped, polite smile intact. "Good morning. I'm with the volunteer team. Here's my badge." She extended it toward him, voice steady and courteous. Jason didn't even take the badge from her hand. He gave it the briefest glance before shaking his head. "Doesn't matter. We're not letting just anyone in. Step back across the street." The father, holding his daughter nearby, frowned, confused. The grandmother beside him clutched her flag tighter. People around them slowed their conversations, sensing the tension. They could hear the officer's clipped tone, the way he dismissed her without hesitation. Monique spoke again, still calm. "I've been cleared. If you'd like, I can call the coordinator right now." Jason's tone grew sharper. "I already told you, move. Don't argue with me." When Monique didn't back away, Jason stepped closer, hand reaching for her arm. His grip was firm, unnecessarily forceful, as though he were handling a trespasser. A collective gasp came from those who witnessed it. Nearby, Danielle Coleman, a local journalist covering parade prep for her outlet's livestream, caught the whole thing. Her phone camera zoomed in as Jason gripped Monique's arm. Viewers on the livestream saw the scene unfold in real time. Comments popped up instantly. "Whoa, what is this cop doing? She has a badge." "Looks like harassment." Monique pulled her arm free, firmly but without aggression. "Officer, you're making a mistake," she said. Jason sneered. "No, you're the one making a mistake thinking you can sneak in here with that vest. You're not supposed to be here." The disdain in his voice, the way he looked her up and down, it was enough for the crowd to understand. This wasn't about rules. This was about who he thought she was. Brett Morgan, the parade coordinator, hustled over, clipboard in hand. His cheeks were flushed red with frustration. "She's with us," he shouted. "Her name is right here on the roster. She's been cleared for access." Jason didn't even look at the clipboard. "I don't care what your paperwork says. She's not coming through." By now, more families and volunteers had gathered. Whispers ran through the crowd. A young man pulled out his phone, searching Monique's name. Within seconds, he showed his mother, a picture of Monique Harris on a Senate website. "Mom," he whispered, "that's her. She's a senator." Others recognized her too. A teacher murmured to her friend, "She's on the Armed Services Committee. What is he thinking?" Danielle Coleman's livestream viewership soared. Comments flooded in. "That's Senator Harris. She's literally a senator. This guy has no clue who he's messing with. This is embarrassing for the whole town." Monique, unshaken, looked directly at Jason. "You are obstructing a United States senator." For the first time, Jason faltered, but his pride wouldn't let him step down. "Lady, don't play games with me. If you were really who you claim, you wouldn't be wearing that vest." Brett shouted, "She is who she says she is!" His voice cracked with outrage. "You're humiliating this city!" The whispers turned into louder voices now. People shouted at Jason to check the roster. Others told him to let her through. But Jason's jaw clenched, his authority challenged, and he doubled down. Monique didn't flinch. She straightened her posture, her voice carrying steady power. "I am Senator Monique Harris, member of the United States Senate Armed Services Committee, and you, officer, are detaining me without cause." The eruption was immediate. Gasps, exclamations, murmurs surged through the street. Veterans in the crowd exchanged incredulous looks. Parents whispered explanations to their children. Danielle's livestream comment section became a blur of shocked messages. "She just said it outright, Senator Harris. This is going viral." "He's finished." Jason's authority was crumbling before the eyes of hundreds. His smirk wavered. He stammered, That's not possible." But his voice had lost its confidence. Monique didn't shout. She didn't need to. Her calm command spoke louder than anger ever could. "Are you going to let me through, officer? Or are you going to escalate this mistake even further?" The silence that followed was deafening. All around, the parade atmosphere had dissolved. The music, the laughter, the casual cheer, all gone. What remained was the image of an officer standing stubbornly before a senator, his arrogance unraveling as reality sank in. But even if Jason backed down in that moment, the damage was done. Danielle's livestream had captured everything. Phones all around had recorded the confrontation. The image of Officer Jason Whitaker gripping a senator's arm while dismissing her credentials was burned into memory, and soon it would be on every screen in America. For Monique, the moment was not about spectacle, it was about the principle. She knew what she represented, she knew the stakes, and she knew this was only the beginning of a much larger storm. The parade would go on, but Riverton and Jason Whitaker would never forget what had just happened. Long before the confrontation at Riverton's parade, Monique Harris had learned that dignity often came with a price. Her life had been shaped not just by ambition, but by countless moments where she had been underestimated, dismissed, or doubted, moments that forged her resilience. Monique was born and raised in Riverton itself, a city that straddled the line between industrial grit and suburban charm. Her parents, Charles and Evelyn Harris, worked hard to give their children stability. Charles was a postal worker who believed in routine, discipline, and the pride of providing. Evelyn was a schoolteacher, gentle yet firm, who instilled in her children the idea that education was both a right and a responsibility. Monique, the middle child of three, grew up in a modest two-story home not far from the very street where the parade incident would later unfold. Summers were filled with block parties, church gatherings, and the hum of lawn mowers. Winters brought snowball fights, hot cocoa, and evenings huddled around the television, watching the news together. It was during those evenings that Monique first noticed the disconnect between what the world claimed America was and what she often saw in her own neighborhood. She watched as politicians made grand speeches about equality while her neighbors struggled with underfunded schools, pothole-riddled streets, and jobs that barely paid enough to survive. At age 12, Monique joined her mother at a school board meeting, listening as Evelyn pleaded for better resources for her students. A board member brushed her off with a smile that felt more like a dismissal. Monique never forgot the sting of watching her mother's words treated as unimportant. By high school, Monique was already known for her voice. She was captain of the debate team, where she honed the art of dismantling arguments with precision. Teachers often remarked that she had a presence far beyond her years. "When Monique speaks," one of them said, "the room pays attention." But presence alone wasn't enough. She faced the subtle, cutting comments that followed her throughout her youth. Counselors suggested she consider realistic career options. Classmates assumed she was only admitted into certain programs because of quotas. Each slight hardened her resolve, each dismissal fueled her fire. When she earned a scholarship to a top university, some neighbors whispered that she would probably drop out or come back home within a year. Instead, Monique thrived. She majored in political science, drawn to the mechanics of power and the language of policy. She interned at the state capitol, running errands at first, then quickly earning trust for her keen observations and tireless work ethic. By the time she graduated, she wasn't just another face in the crowd, she was a rising voice. Her first job was as a community organizer back in Riverton, where she tackled issues like housing discrimination and wage theft. Monique didn't just show up to meetings. She stood at the front, clipboard in hand, leading chants, drafting petitions, and holding city leaders accountable. It was during one of those rallies that she first met Danielle Coleman, then a rookie reporter for the local paper. Danielle remembered covering a protest outside a landlord's office, watching Monique energize a crowd with her words. "She doesn't just speak," Danielle wrote in her article. "She commands." From there, Monique's path only widened. She ran for city council in her early 30s, becoming one of the youngest and one of the few black women to hold the seat. Her focus was on practical solutions, improving public transit, securing funds for schools, holding the police department accountable for misconduct. Her tenure wasn't without controversy. She sparred with entrenched officials, faced pushback from unions, and even endured threats. But she never wavered. Her reputation as a fighter grew, and soon she had a choice: remain a local leader or aim higher. Encouraged by her constituents, she ran for Congress. The campaign was grueling, marked by smear ads and constant questioning of her qualifications. But Monique's connection to the people carried her through. She didn't just talk about policy, she shared stories of families she knew, streets she had walked, problems she had witnessed firsthand. When she won her congressional seat, she did so with a mandate to represent the overlooked, the underestimated, the silenced. In Washington, she navigated halls filled with power brokers who often underestimated her the same way Riverton had years before. Yet, she proved her worth again and again, mastering defense budgets, veterans affairs, and strategic policy debates that placed her squarely on the Armed Services Committee. Still, despite her national platform, Monique remained grounded in Riverton. Every year she returned for the 4th of July parade, She saw it as a reminder of where she came from, a way to stay connected to the community that raised her. Unlike other politicians who only appeared for photo ops, Monique volunteered behind the scenes, handing out water bottles, helping children find their places in the lineup, making sure the event ran smoothly. It was her way of giving back, but it also reflected something deeper, her refusal to ever forget the roots that shaped her. So when Officer Jason Whitaker dismissed her that morning, when he gripped her arm and called her a troublemaker, Monique recognized the pattern. It wasn't new. It was the same doubt, the same dismissal, the same arrogance she had encountered her entire life. The difference now was that she had the power, the platform, and the composure to face it head on. Back at the parade, the whispers of recognition spread quickly. Parents explained to their children who she was. Veterans muttered in disbelief. Danielle's live stream was exploding with viewers who were already tweeting, clipping, and sharing the footage. Jason had no idea yet how far this story would travel, nor how much his actions would haunt him. And Monique knew that, as painful as the moment was, it had the potential to spark a conversation that Riverton, and perhaps the nation, could no longer ignore. Jason Whitaker had never seen himself as the villain. In fact, if you'd asked him on any given day, he would have said he was the opposite, a man who wore the badge proudly, a man who kept order in a chaotic world. To him, every parade, every public event was a test of control, and control was something he clung to like armor. Jason was born and raised in a neighboring county, in a small town where nearly everyone looked the same and thought the same. His father, Richard Whitaker, had been a police officer before him. The Whitaker name carried weight at the local diner, in the high school gym, and especially within the police department. Growing up, Jason didn't dream of being a doctor, teacher, or entrepreneur. He was going to follow the family line, strap on a badge, and carry the authority that came with it. But Jason inherited not just his father's profession, it was his father's worldview that shaped him most. Richard was known as old school, the kind of cop who prided himself on toughness, who believed respect was earned through intimidation rather than fairness. Around the dinner table, Richard often spoke about troublemakers, about knowing who belonged and who didn't, about keeping the streets in line. Jason absorbed every word, every story. To him, his father's authority wasn't just a career, it was the blueprint of manhood. In school, Jason coasted. He wasn't the brightest student, but he was aggressive enough to avoid being bullied, athletic enough to keep teachers satisfied, and charming enough when he needed to be. What he lacked in discipline, he made up for in attitude. By the time he graduated, his path was already laid out. The police academy, a badge, a uniform, and the same reputation his father had carved out years earlier. The academy wasn't difficult for Jason. Rules, drills, procedures, they were hurdles he could jump without much effort. What stuck with him most was the culture, the locker room talk, the US versus them mentality, the unspoken hierarchy of who deserved respect and who didn't. Jason thrived in it. He learned that confidence, or at least the appearance of it, was often more valuable than actual competence. When he joined the Riverton Police Department, Jason saw himself as a natural enforcer. He strutted on his beat, quick to assert authority, quick to remind civilians who was in charge. Complaints trickled in from time to time about his tone, his heavy-handedness, his dismissiveness, but they never stuck. The department had bigger issues, and Jason's record on paper looked clean enough. Yet underneath the polished badge, Jason carried an insecurity he rarely admitted, even to himself. He didn't like being questioned. He didn't like being told he was wrong. And above all, he couldn't stand the idea that someone he saw as beneath him might actually hold more power. That morning at the Riverton parade, all of those insecurities collided. When he saw Monique Harris approaching the barricade, his instincts fired not with caution, but with judgment. He didn't see a senator, a community leader, or a volunteer. He saw someone who didn't fit the picture he had in his head of authority. In his mind, her vest, her badge, her calm demeanor, none of it mattered. What mattered was that she didn't fit his definition of belonging. So when she stood her ground, when she spoke back with quiet confidence, it rattled him. His grip tightened, not just on her arm, but on the illusion of control he thought he had. And then came the words that pierced through his arrogance. "I am Senator Monique Harris, member of the United States Senate Armed Services Committee." Jason's smirk had faltered. His stomach had dropped, but his pride wouldn't let him retreat. Instead, he doubled down, denying what was obvious to everyone else. That denial was his undoing, because while Jason clung to his pride, Danielle Coleman's livestream was exploding. Her phone buzzed with notifications as thousands tuned in, sharing clips across platforms. By the time Jason insisted Monique couldn't possibly be who she claimed, the internet already knew she was exactly that. Within an hour, the footage had made its way beyond Riverton. Major journalists retweeted it. Political commentators clipped the exchange. Hashtags began trending. "Gian Senator at the parade," "Shem Riverton confrontation," "Shen respect her office." In living rooms across the country, people who had never heard of Riverton were suddenly watching a police officer grip a senator's arm, dismiss her credentials, and call her a troublemaker. Inside the Riverton Police Department, phones rang non-stop. Commanders scrambled to respond, unsure how to contain the damage. City officials exchanged frantic messages. And Jason? Jason remained oblivious for longer than he should have, still stationed at his barricade, still convinced he had done his job. What he didn't realize yet was that the country was watching. His name, his face, his arrogance, captured in high definition, had already begun its viral march into infamy. And Monique Harris, the woman he tried to silence, was about to become the center of a national conversation. By the afternoon, Riverton was no longer just hosting a parade. It was hosting a national scandal. The footage Danielle Coleman had captured, Jason Whitaker gripping Senator Monique Harris's arm, dismissing her credentials, and sneering at her authority, had spread like wildfire. Local chatter turned into national outrage, and by evening the confrontation had become headline news. Cable news anchors ran the clip on repeat, their voices laced with disbelief. "What you're seeing," one anchor explained, "is a sitting U.S. Senator on the Armed Services Committee being prevented from entering a parade where she was volunteering by a police officer who refused to recognize her credentials, and even after a coordinator confirmed her authorization." In Riverton, city officials scrambled. Mayor Rachel Morris convened an emergency meeting with the chief of police, Lauren Bennett, and several senior advisors. The mayor's phone buzzed with calls from constituents, state officials, and reporters. She leaned forward at the table, exhaustion etched into her face. "Tell me this isn't as bad as it looks," Rachel demanded. Chief Bennett hesitated. "The video, it's bad. The officer, Whitaker, handled it poorly." "Poorly?" Rachel snapped. "He manhandled a senator in front of hundreds of people. That's not just poor, that's catastrophic." City Hall wasn't the only place in chaos. The Riverton Police Department's phone lines were clogged with furious residents demanding accountability. Some callers wanted Whitaker suspended immediately. Others demanded his firing. Still others threatened protests outside the precinct. Meanwhile, Monique Harris had retreated quietly to a nearby community center after the parade ended. She wasn't one to seek attention, but the calls from colleagues in Washington were unavoidable. Senators, representatives, and even military officials on the Armed Services Committee called to check on her. Some expressed outrage, others urged caution, but the consensus was clear. The footage struck a nerve nationwide. Sitting in a modest office at the community center, Monique took a deep breath. Danielle Coleman had followed her there, asking for a comment. Monique wasn't ready to give an official statement, but she knew silence wasn't an option. "Danielle," Monique said, her tone measured, "what happened today wasn't just about me. It was about how easily authority can be abused and how quickly dignity can be denied. I will speak, but I need to choose my words carefully." Danielle nodded. "Senator, the people are already rallying behind you. That video, it's everywhere. Folks are angry." Monique allowed herself a small, weary smile. Anger can be useful, but only if it's directed toward change. Back at the police station, Jason Whitaker sat in the break room, still unaware of the storm brewing outside. He knew the crowd had turned against him, but he told himself it was a misunderstanding, that people didn't understand how rules worked. When a fellow officer finally showed him a clip on a phone, Jason's expression shifted from smugness to unease. "This is out of context," he muttered. "She didn't look like a senator." But excuses couldn't shield him from reality. His name was trending, his face was on every screen. His arrogance had been documented, dissected, and condemned. That evening, as fireworks lit the Riverton sky, the parade felt hollow. Families gathered, children squealed at the colors, but conversations circled back to one thing: the senator and the cop. Some spoke with shame, others with fury, and still others with disbelief that such a thing could happen in their own city. By nightfall, national leaders had weighed in. A senator from another state tweeted, "No public servant should ever be treated with such disrespect. Senator Harris is a colleague and a friend. What happened in Riverton is unacceptable." Advocacy groups released statements condemning Jason's behavior and demanding accountability. The city's image, carefully built over years of community events and patriotic displays, was now overshadowed by a single viral video. And at the heart of it all, Monique Harris prepared for what came next. She wasn't just a victim of an officer's arrogance. She was a public figure, a senator whose response would set the tone for the days ahead. She knew the next move had to be hers. The following morning, Riverton woke to the echo of its own shame. News vans lined the streets outside City Hall. Satellite dishes sprouted like steel flowers, cameras perched on tripods, and reporters rehearsed their live shots against the backdrop of flashing police lights. Overnight, the confrontation at the parade had transformed into a national flashpoint. Inside her modest Riverton home, Monique Harris sat at the kitchen table, a cup of black coffee in her hand. She hadn't slept more than a few hours, her phone buzzing relentlessly with calls from Washington. Her staff urged her to hold a press conference. Colleagues told her she had to respond forcefully. Advocacy groups wanted her to frame it as part of a larger pattern of misconduct. But Monique wasn't one to react impulsively. She thought about her mother Evelyn, who had always told her, "When people expect you to scream, speak steady. When they expect you to fold, stand taller." By mid-morning, Monique arrived at City Hall. A crowd had already gathered, supporters holding handmade signs that read, "Respect our senator and accountability now." There were also skeptics in the back muttering about blown out of proportion. But the overwhelming energy was with Monique. Mayor Rachel Morris and Chief Lauren Bennett stood nervously off to the side, whispering to one another. They knew this was no longer a local problem. It was national, and Monique's words would determine Riverton's place in the headlines for weeks to come. Stepping to the podium, Monique looked out at the sea of cameras. Flashes popped, microphones thrust forward, the chatter quieted. She adjusted the microphone, her voice clear and unwavering. "Yesterday," she began, "I volunteered for an event that has been part of my community since childhood. I came to serve, to help, and to give back. Instead, I was met with hostility. I was dismissed, mishandled, and disrespected by an officer of this city." Her words carried weight. They weren't rushed, but deliberate. Each sentence landed with precision. "I am not here today to focus on myself alone. I am here because what happened is bigger than one senator at one parade. It is about what happens when authority forgets its purpose. Authority is not meant to diminish, but to protect. Authority is not meant to humiliate, but to uphold dignity." Applause broke out in the crowd. Monique held up her hand, quieting them. "I have served in the United States Senate with honor. I have debated matters of national security, defense budgets, and the safety of our armed forces. And yet, in my own hometown, an officer looked at me and saw not a senator, not a volunteer, not even a neighbor, but someone he felt entitled to dismiss and detain without cause. That should trouble every one of us." Mayor Morris shifted uncomfortably. Chief Bennett's jaw tightened. Reporters scribbled furiously. Monique continued, her tone steady but firm. I call on the city of Riverton and its police department to review not only this incident but the culture that allows such incidents to occur. I am not asking for symbolic gestures. I am demanding systemic accountability. We cannot celebrate freedom in the morning and ignore injustice by afternoon. The crowd erupted, chants echoing through the plaza. Accountability now! Accountability now! Jason Whitaker, watching the press conference on a small television in the station's break room, felt his stomach twist. The words weren't just directed at the department, they were directed at him. His face, frozen in viral clips, had become the symbol of everything Monique described. The press conference ended with Monique stepping away from the podium, refusing to take shouted questions. She had said what needed to be said, and she knew the ripple effects would spread far beyond Riverton. That evening, networks replayed her speech in full. Commentators dissected her phrasing, her poise, her refusal to let anger overshadow clarity. Some called it one of the strongest rebukes of misconduct by a sitting senator in recent memory. And while Monique returned to her home quietly, the storm outside only grew louder. The city council announced an emergency session. Civil rights groups announced a march. The Riverton Police Department placed Jason Whitaker on administrative leave pending investigation. But for Monique Harris, the battle wasn't about one officer's arrogance. It was about what came next, whether Riverton and perhaps the country would truly confront the deeper issue her confrontation had exposed. The walls of the Riverton Police Department had never felt so suffocating. Officer Jason Whitaker sat alone in the break room staring at a muted television replaying Senator Monique Harris's press conference. The sound was off, but the closed captions were enough to make his face flush crimson. Each word she had spoken now followed him like a shadow. Dismissed, mishandled, disrespected. Jason wasn't used to being the one on trial, not in the public's eye. For years he had walked Riverton streets with an air of unchallenged authority. When someone complained about his tone, his supervisors brushed it aside. When a teenager accused him of rough handling during a traffic stop, the department chalked it up to miscommunication. Jason had always assumed the badge insulated him, but this was different. This wasn't a teenager with no platform. This wasn't a faceless complaint buried in paperwork. This was a United States senator, a woman whose words carried national weight, whose influence stretched into the highest echelons of power. And now, her face and his were forever linked in a viral video that millions had seen. At first, Jason tried to cling to denial. He muttered to colleagues, "The video doesn't show the whole story. She was trying to get through without clearance." But the looks on their faces told him otherwise. They weren't buying it, and worse, they didn't want to be seen siding with him. Administrative leave was supposed to feel like a pause. Instead, it felt like exile. Jason was ordered to turn in his badge and service weapon temporarily, and the moment he set them on the chief's desk, the weight of his situation sank in. Without the badge, he wasn't Officer Whitaker anymore. He was just Jason, a man whose arrogance had dragged an entire department into crisis. Outside the station, protesters gathered daily. Some carried signs with Monique's words painted in bold letters. "Authority is not meant to humiliate." Others carried signs with Jason's face, the still image of him gripping Monique's arm, under captions like, "Unfit to serve." Jason tried to avoid the crowds, slipping out of the station through side doors, but the city was small, and anonymity had vanished. At the grocery store, people stared. At the gas station, whispers followed him. A teenager filming on his phone asked mockingly, "Hey, officer, going to grab my arm too?" Jason stormed back into his car, humiliated. At home, the tension was worse. His wife, Amanda Riley, struggled to hold the family together. Their two kids, both in middle school, faced relentless questions from classmates. "Is your dad the cop who grabbed the senator?" one boy taunted. The children came home in tears more than once, asking why their father couldn't just say sorry. Amanda pleaded with him at night. "Jason, you need to own this. People might forgive you if you apologize." But Jason bristled. "Apologize? For doing my job? She pushed her way in without clearance." Amanda sighed. "She didn't push her way in. She was on the list. Everyone knows that now." Jason slammed his fist on the table. "She embarrassed me in front of everyone. If she had just said who she was at the start—" Amanda cut him off, her voice trembling. "She did say who she was. You just refused to hear it." The silence that followed was heavier than any argument. Meanwhile, the department's Internal Affairs Unit launched its investigation. They interviewed Brett Morgan, the parade coordinator, who testified that Monique's name was on the roster. They spoke to Danielle Coleman, who provided her full live stream footage. They interviewed bystanders, many of whom echoed the same account. Jason dismissed Monique, ignored proof of her authorization, and physically grabbed her without cause. The case against him was undeniable. Jason tried to seek sympathy from fellow officers, but even those who once considered him an ally now kept their distance. He had become radioactive, a liability. The chief made it clear. "You embarrassed this department. The senator's office is watching, the mayor's office is watching, and frankly, the whole country is watching. You put us all in a corner." In private, Jason's bitterness festered. He convinced himself he was the victim of a political game, that Monique had used the situation to score points. He scrolled through social media endlessly, angry at the memes, the ridicule, the hashtags. His once proud name had become a punchline, but even Jason couldn't deny the truth forever. Late at night, in the quiet of his living room, he replayed the video. He watched himself sneering, gripping Monique's arm, dismissing her words. He watched her stand tall, calm, commanding, while he looked smaller and smaller with every second. For the first time, Jason saw himself the way the world saw him, not as a man in control, but as a man exposed. And he realized that no matter what he told himself, no matter how much he protested, his career would never recover. The confrontation in Riverton had begun as a single incident, a tense exchange at a parade checkpoint. But by the end of that week, it had become a symbol. The image of Officer Jason Whitaker gripping Senator Monique Harris's arm was no longer just a clip on social media. It was plastered on magazine covers, dissected on talk shows, and debated in living rooms across America. For Monique, the shift was immediate. Before the incident, she was respected, but not necessarily a household name outside of political circles. Now she was a figure of national conversation. Her speech at City Hall, calm and resolute, was replayed alongside clips of Jason's sneering dismissal. Commentators praised her composure, calling it a masterclass in leadership under pressure. Editorials framed her as a symbol of dignity in the face of arrogance. Yet Monique was cautious. She had no interest in becoming a celebrity. To her, visibility was only useful if it could be channeled into action. In the days after the confrontation, she began speaking not only about her personal experience, but also about systemic accountability. In interviews, she said, "What happened to me in Riverton is not isolated. Many Americans face this kind of treatment without cameras, without titles, without a platform. We have to ask ourselves what it means when authority treats dignity as optional." Her words resonated. Civil rights organizations amplified her message. Community groups invited her to speak. Veterans associations, usually focused solely on military issues, voiced support for her leadership, noting that her position on the Armed Services Committee made her stance all the more significant. In Riverton, the ripple effects were seismic. Protests swelled outside the police department. Some were peaceful marches, families holding signs that read, "Dignity for all," and "Authority with respect." Others were more confrontational, with chants directly calling for Jason Whitaker's termination. Mayor Rachel Morris found herself in a political storm she hadn't anticipated. Once a popular figure, she now faced questions about how her administration would respond. In council meetings, members demanded reforms, review boards, new training protocols, and even the removal of the police chief. "We can't just wait this out," one council member said. "The world is watching Riverton." The national media framed Riverton as a microcosm of a larger American issue, the balance between authority and accountability. News segments showed split screens, on one side the parade footage, on the other historical clips of similar confrontations where ordinary citizens had been dismissed, disrespected, or harmed. The comparison was clear. Monique Harris's experience might have been unique because of her title, but the dynamic was all too familiar to countless others. Jason Whittaker became an unwilling symbol of that dynamic. His name was invoked in editorials as a cautionary tale. Headlines read, "The Whittaker Lesson, When Authority Refuses to Listen." His defenders dwindled quickly, reduced to a handful of voices claiming he didn't know who she was or he was just doing his job. But even those defenses fell flat, especially when confronted with the evidence that Monique had shown her badge, that Brett Morgan had vouched for her, and that Jason's grip on her arm had been unnecessary from the start. In Washington, the ripple reached the Senate floor. Colleagues of Monique referenced the incident in speeches, not to sensationalize, but to highlight the need for respect between institutions of power and the citizens they serve. "If this can happen to a sitting senator," one colleague said, "imagine how easily it can happen to someone without her visibility." Monique, for her part, continued her work quietly but deliberately. She refused to let the incident define her entirely, but she also refused to let it be minimized. She spoke in committee meetings with the same steadiness she had shown at the podium in Riverton. She attended community gatherings not for applause but for listening. What struck people most was her refusal to be bitter. When asked in an interview if she hated Jason Whittaker, Monique shook her head. "I don't hate him," she said. "I don't even want this to be about him alone. I want it to be about how we ensure no officer, no official, no authority figure forgets the purpose of their role. We can't build trust if authority is rooted in dismissal." Her words were clipped into motivational reels, shared across platforms, quoted in classrooms. Students studying civics debated her stance. Churches used her speech as an example of moral courage, and veterans groups cited her as a leader who embodied both strength and humility. Back in Riverton, the transformation was visible. The city that once prided itself solely on its parade was now known for something else, the place where arrogance collided with dignity, and dignity refused to bow. The ripple effect hadn't just elevated Monique Harris. It had forced an entire community and perhaps a nation to confront the uncomfortable question she had posed. What happens when authority forgets its purpose? And for Jason Whittaker, the ripple was a wave he couldn't outrun. The Riverton City Council chambers had never been so crowded. Rows of wooden benches, usually half empty during routine municipal meetings, overflowed with residents, reporters, and activists. Cameras lined the back wall, their red lights blinking like eyes fixed on the spectacle. The council had called a special disciplinary hearing to determine the fate of Officer Jason Whittaker. Jason sat stiffly at the front, his uniform replaced by a plain suit that looked borrowed and ill-fitting. His wife, Amanda Riley, sat behind him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her eyes fixed downward. Their children were not there. Amanda had insisted they stay home, away from the spectacle. The hearing opened with testimony from witnesses. Brett Morgan, the parade coordinator, spoke first. His voice was steady, but his frustration was palpable. "I told Officer Whittaker that Senator Harris was on the roster. Her name was printed clearly. I vouched for her in person. He refused to listen." Next came Danielle Coleman, the reporter whose live stream had captured the confrontation. She provided her unedited footage as evidence, the clip replayed on a large monitor for everyone to see. The grainy image of Jason gripping Monique's arm, his sneering dismissal, Monique's calm assertion of her title. It played in silence except for the faint hum of the audio. The room seemed to hold its breath as the evidence looped. When the video ended, murmurs rippled through the crowd. Jason shifted in his chair, his jaw tight, his eyes darting away from the screen. The council then called community members to speak. Parents, teachers, veterans, and ordinary citizens stepped forward one by one. Some spoke with anger. "That officer disgraced our city." Others spoke with sadness. "If he could treat a senator that way, how do you think he treats the rest of us?" Each testimony painted the same picture. Jason's arrogance wasn't an isolated incident, but the tip of a deeper problem. Finally, Jason himself was given the chance to speak. He cleared his throat, his voice strained. "I want to make it clear that I never intended disrespect. I was doing my job. The area was restricted. I didn't recognize Senator Harris, and I acted based on the information I had at the time." Gasps and groans erupted from the crowd. One man shouted, "She showed you her badge." Another yelled, "The coordinator vouched for her." The council president banged his gavel for order. Jason pressed on, his words defensive. "It's easy to judge now, with hindsight and video clips. But in the moment, I believed I was maintaining security. I regret how it looked, but my intent was never malicious." Amanda winced. Even she knew the words rang hollow. The council deliberated for less than an hour. When they returned, the verdict was unanimous. Officer Jason Whitaker would be terminated from the Riverton Police Department. The decision cited misconduct, abuse of authority, and damage to public trust. The announcement was met with applause from the audience. Protesters outside cheered, chanting Monique's words. "Authority is not meant to humiliate." Jason sat frozen. His career, his family legacy was gone in an instant. His father's shadow, the badge he had once clung to with pride, all of it had crumbled under the weight of his own arrogance. In the weeks that followed, Jason's downfall only deepened. He applied for law enforcement jobs in neighboring towns, but no department would touch him. His name was too infamous, his record too tarnished. Friends he once considered allies stopped returning his calls. Even officers who had once laughed at his swagger now distanced themselves, unwilling to be associated with him. At home, the strain was unbearable. Amanda shouldered the burden of keeping their family afloat, taking extra shifts at her job. Their children struggled with the whispers at school, the mocking jokes about their father. Jason grew bitter, spending long hours isolated in the garage, replaying the incident in his mind, still trying to convince himself he had been right. But the world had moved on. In Riverton, reforms began to take shape. The city council approved the creation of a civilian review board to oversee complaints against the police department. Training programs on de-escalation and bias were mandated. Chief Lauren Bennett, under intense scrutiny, announced a department-wide review of policies and procedures. And through it all, Monique Harris's words continued to echo. She hadn't asked for Jason's downfall, but his actions had written his fate. Her call for accountability had become Riverton's blueprint for change. Jason Whitaker, once a man who believed his badge made him untouchable, now stood as the city's cautionary tale, proof of what happens when authority forgets its purpose. The air in Washington felt different after Riverton. Colleagues who had once treated Senator Monique Harris with polite but distant respect now approached her with visible admiration. The confrontation, caught in shaky live-stream footage, had reshaped her image. She was no longer just a diligent senator known for long committee hearings and meticulous policy work. She had become a national symbol of composure under pressure, of authority held with grace. But Monique resisted the urge to revel in the attention. For her, the incident wasn't a stepping stone. It was a reminder of why she had entered public service in the first place, and why her community back in Riverton remained at the center of her purpose. In the weeks following the parade, Monique received invitations from networks, universities, and advocacy organizations. She appeared on evening news programs, where anchors asked her to recount what had happened. "Did you feel afraid?" one host asked. Monique answered calmly, "I didn't feel fear. I felt frustration. I felt the weight of dismissal, not just for myself, but for everyone who has experienced it without recognition. Clips of her interviews went viral in their own right. Students quoted her in essays. Civil rights leaders cited her as proof that accountability was still possible in America. Even late-night hosts, while delivering monologues, played the clip of Officer Jason Whitaker's sneering face, followed by Monique's steady declaration, "I am a United States Senator." The audience roared, but Monique never let the laughter or applause dilute her message. Her colleagues on Capitol Hill took notice, too. Members of her committee remarked on how the incident had sharpened her voice in hearings. When defense contractors came to testify, she was more pointed in her questioning. When military leaders presented budgets, she pressed them not just on numbers but on principles. "Respect begins at home," she said during one session. "How can we expect accountability abroad if we lack it here?" Her words landed differently now. They weren't just lines in a transcript. They were lived experience, sharpened by a moment the whole country had seen. Back in Riverton, the city struggled to define itself beyond the scandal. For decades, it had prided itself on its annual parade, its small-town charm, its patriotic festivals. Now, when people heard Riverton, they thought of Jason Whitaker gripping a senator's arm. The mayor's office launched a campaign to rebuild trust. Public forums were held where residents voiced grievances not just about the parade incident, but about years of feeling dismissed by authority. Mothers spoke of their sons being stopped without cause. Veterans spoke of being talked down to by younger officers. Teachers described how students whispered about bad cops in hallways. Chief Lauren Bennett, under immense pressure, instituted reforms. Officers were sent to new training programs focusing on de-escalation, cultural sensitivity, and community engagement. A civilian review board began accepting complaints, its members drawn from local churches, schools, and businesses. For the first time in Riverton's history, authority wasn't policing itself alone. Yet healing was uneven. Some residents resisted change, arguing that Jason had been scapegoated. "He didn't know who she was," one man muttered at a town hall, but those voices were drowned out by others, louder and firmer. "She showed him her badge. He didn't care. That's the problem." In schools, teachers used the incident as a civics lesson. Students debated authority, accountability, and civic duty. One classroom project recreated the City Hall press conference with students playing Monique, Jason, and the council. The lesson wasn't lost on them. Dignity should never be negotiable. Monique returned to Riverton several weeks after Jason's termination, not for spectacle, but for reflection. She walked through the very streets where the confrontation had unfolded, greeted by neighbors who thanked her for her composure. At the community center, children handed her drawings of the parade, some depicting her in her volunteer vest, standing tall. At a town hall, Monique spoke softly but firmly. "I didn't want this to define our city. Riverton is more than one moment, more than one man's arrogance. But if this moment has forced us to reflect, to change, then perhaps it was not in vain." Her words were met with applause, but also with silence. The silence of those still wrestling with shame, still struggling to accept that their beloved parade had become the stage for a national reckoning. In Washington, Monique's visibility grew. She was asked to co-sponsor legislation aimed at increasing police accountability nationwide. The bill proposed federal funding for community review boards, mandatory de-escalation training, and consequences for departments that ignored patterns of misconduct. Monique accepted the role, but with humility. "This is not about me," she told her staff. "This is about making sure authority everywhere remembers its purpose." Her fellow senators took note. Even those across the aisle who disagreed with her on other issues respected the clarity of her stance. One remarked privately, "She handled herself better in that moment than most of us could have." Monique became a sought-after speaker at universities. At one lecture, a student asked, "What gave you the strength to stay calm when he grabbed your arm?" Monique smiled. Strength is not in shouting louder. It's in refusing to let someone else dictate your dignity. That line was quoted for months afterward, painted on posters, shared on social media, stitched into banners at rallies. Meanwhile, Jason Whitaker faded into obscurity. His attempts to find work in law enforcement failed. His name was too toxic, his record too visible. He tried applying for private security jobs, but background checks always revealed the viral video. Even those who sympathized with him wouldn't risk the public backlash of hiring him. At home, bitterness consumed him. Amanda Riley eventually moved out, taking their children with her. The strain of public humiliation, financial instability, and Jason's refusal to accept responsibility tore the family apart. Alone, Jason drifted from one odd job to another, his name still a whispered warning in Riverton. For the city, his downfall was both a wound and a lesson. By the end of the year, Monique Harris had become more than a senator. She was a national symbol. Advocacy groups placed her image on posters alongside quotes from her speeches. Civil rights leaders invited her to marches and summits. Editorials praised her ability to turn personal humiliation into public change. Yet Monique never let herself forget the simplicity of what had happened. In her office, framed on the wall, was a copy of the volunteer badge she had worn that morning. Below it, a handwritten note from a child in Riverton read, "Thank you for standing strong." When asked about the note, Monique always gave the same answer. This isn't about titles or committees. It's about dignity. If we can't protect dignity, then what are we really protecting? Her words resonated across the nation. And though Riverton continued to rebuild, the parade confrontation remained etched in its history, a moment when arrogance collided with dignity, and dignity refused to bow. The 4th of July parade in Riverton became a story retold not for its fireworks or floats, but for the lesson it carried into the heart of America. Months had passed since the confrontation between Officer Jason Whitaker and Senator Monique Harris. Yet its echoes were everywhere, on television, in classrooms, in city halls across the country. What had begun as a small-town humiliation had become a national parable about dignity, authority, and accountability. Riverton itself changed in ways no one could have predicted. The city, once defined by its quaint parades and patriotic festivals, found itself at the forefront of a movement. The Civilian Review Board created after Jason's termination became a model for other towns. Representatives from neighboring counties traveled to Riverton to study its new training programs and transparency measures. Mayor Rachel Morris, once shaken by the scandal, leaned into reform. She convened quarterly town halls, inviting residents to speak directly with police leadership. Chief Lauren Bennett, under watchful eyes, pushed her officers to build trust rather than intimidate. Slowly, the department's image began to heal, though the memory of Jason's arrogance remained a scar the city would not forget. At the next 4th of July parade, changes were visible everywhere. Volunteers wore clear identification, officers received explicit de-escalation training beforehand, and Monique Harris returned, this time not as a volunteer in the shadows, but as the honorary Grand Marshal. As she walked down Main Street, children waved flags, veterans saluted, and families shouted her name. Yet Monique didn't bask in the adoration. She waved, she smiled, but she carried herself with the same quiet dignity she had shown the day Jason tried to dismiss her. For Riverton, her presence wasn't just a symbol of pride, it was a reminder of resilience. While Riverton redefined itself, Jason Whitaker disappeared from public life. After his termination, he struggled to find stability. His bitterness alienated those who once supported him, and his refusal to take responsibility only deepened his isolation. Amanda Riley finalized her separation, moving with their children to another town where their last name carried less weight. Jason remained in Riverton, living on the edges of the city that no longer welcomed him. Occasionally, residents spotted him at the grocery store or gas station, his posture slumped, his once proud gait replaced by a shuffle. Few spoke to him. Those who did said he muttered about being set up or unfairly judged. But the world had moved on, and Jason had become a relic of what Riverton wanted to leave behind. In Washington, Monique's influence expanded. She became a key sponsor of the Dignity and Authority Act, legislation aimed at promoting accountability within law enforcement nationwide. The bill proposed funding for civilian oversight boards, standardized de-escalation training, and stricter consequences for officers who abused authority. Though it faced opposition, Monique's ability to frame the issue with clarity and personal conviction swayed many. On the Senate floor, she delivered a speech that echoed far beyond Capitol Hill. Authority is not armor, it is responsibility. It is not given to diminish, but to protect. When we forget this, we erode the very foundation of trust between the people and those sworn to serve them. Riverton was my home long before it was a headline, and if change can happen there, it can happen anywhere. The speech was quoted in newspapers nationwide. It was played in classrooms. It became the cornerstone of her growing legacy. Despite the attention, Monique never lost sight of her roots. She continued visiting Riverton often, meeting with students, teachers, and families. At one school assembly, a young girl asked her, "Senator Harris, did you ever feel small when the officer told you to leave?" Monique paused, her expression soft. "Yes," she admitted. "But feeling small doesn't mean you are small. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is stand your ground with dignity." Her answer lingered in the auditorium long after she left. By the end of that year, Riverton was no longer defined by the scandal alone. It was defined by what followed: reform, reflection, and resilience. The incident became part of the city's identity, but not as a mark of shame. It became a turning point. For Monique, the parade confrontation was one chapter in a long career, but it was also a crystallizing moment. It reminded her why she had chosen public service, why she fought for accountability, why she believed in dignity as the cornerstone of authority. For Jason, it was the end of one life and the beginning of another, one lived in obscurity, haunted by the viral video that exposed him. And for Riverton, it was a story retold every Independence Day, not as a wound, but as a lesson, that dignity must never bow to arrogance, and that accountability is not optional. Years later, when people remembered the Riverton parade, they didn't speak first of floats or fireworks. They spoke of the woman in the volunteer vest who stood tall when an officer tried to dismiss her. They spoke of the calm voice that declared, "I am a United States Senator." It wasn't just a sentence. It was a statement of principle, a reminder that titles mean little without dignity, and that authority means nothing without accountability. And so Riverton's story became America's story, a caution, a catalyst, and above all, a call to remember what authority is meant to be.